Existential Isolation and Interpersonal Psychopathology. If we fail to develop the inner strength, the sense of personal worth and firm identity that enables us to face existential isolation, to say so be it, and to take anxiety into ourselves, then we will struggle in oblique ways to find safety. In this section I shall examine these safe-seeking methods and their clinical manifestations. For the most part they are relational. That is, they involve interpersonal relationships. But, as we shall see, in each instance the individual does not relate to, that is, does not care for the other but instead uses the other for a function. The terror, the direct awareness of existential isolation, and the psychic defensive structure that we elaborate to assuage anxiety are all unconscious. One knows only that one cannot be alone, that one desperately wants from others something that one is never able to obtain, and that, try as one might, something always goes wrong with one's relationships. Yet another solution lies in the direction of sacrificing selfhood. One gains relief from isolation anxiety through immersion in some other individual, cause, or pursuit. Thus, individuals are, as Kierkegaard said, twice in despair. To begin with, in a fundamental existential despair, and then further in despair because, having sacrificed self-awareness, they do not even know they are in despair. Existing in the eyes of others. The worst thing about being alone, the thought that drives me bananas, is that, at that moment, no one in the world may be thinking about me. So declared a patient in a group session who had been hospitalized because of panic attacks when alone. There was among the other patients in this inpatient therapy group instantaneous agreement with this experience. One 19-year-old who had been hospitalized for slashing her wrists following the breakup of a romantic relationship said simply, "I'd rather be dead than alone." Another said, "When I'm alone, that's when I hear voices. Maybe my voices are a way not to be alone." An arresting fundamental logical explanation of hallucination. Another patient who, on several occasions, had mutilated herself stated that she had done so because of her despair about a highly unsatisfying relationship with a man. Yet she could not leave him because of her terror of being alone. When I asked her what terrified her about loneliness, she said with stark, direct, psychotic insight, "I don't exist when I'm alone." The same dynamic speaks in the child's incessant plea, "Watch me, look at me." The presence of the other is required to make reality real. Here as elsewhere, I cite the child's experience as interior manifestation, not as cause of an underlying conflict. Lewis Carroll, in Through the Looking Glass, wonderfully expressed the stark belief, held by many patients, that I exist only so long as I am thought about. Alice, Tweedledee, and Tweedledemit come upon the Red King sleeping. "He's dreaming now," said Tweedledee. "And what do you think he's dreaming about?" Alice said, "Nobody can guess that." "Why, about you," Tweedledee exclaimed, clapping his hands triumphantly. "And if he left off dreaming about you, where do you suppose he'd be?" "Where I am now, of course," said Alice. "Not you," Tweedledee retorted contemptuously. "You'd be nowhere. Why, you're only a sort of thing in this dream." "If that there king was to wake," added Tweedledee, "you'd go out. Bang. Just like a candle." "I shouldn't," Alice exclaimed indignantly. "Besides, if I'm only a sort of thing in his dream, what are you, I should like to know?" "Ditto," said Tweedledee. "Ditto, ditto," cried Tweedledee. He shouted this so loud that Alice couldn't help saying, "Hush. You'll be waking him, I'm afraid, if you make so much noise." "Well, it's no use your talking about waking him," said Tweedledee, "when you're only one of the things in his dream. You know very well you're not real." "I am real," said Alice, and began to cry. You won't make yourself a bit realer by crying, Tweedledee remarked. There's nothing to cry about. If I wasn't real, Alice said, half laughing through her tears. It all seems so ridiculous. I shouldn't be able to cry. I hope you don't suppose those are real tears. Tweedledee interrupted in a tone of great contempt. One patient in a therapy group commented that once she had been in therapy for several months, and years later chanced to meet a therapist. She was devastated because the therapist took 45 seconds to remember who she was. She then turned toward the group therapist and asked, "Will you always remember me?" "I can't go on if you won't." She was a high school teacher, and was able gradually to accept the cruel fact that just as she would forget her students long before they forgot her, so it was with therapists. The therapist and the teacher are more important to the patient and the student than the other way around. Still, this does not preclude the fact that, as I shall discuss later, when the therapist is with the patient, it is a full, deep presence. Later in the same session, the patient commented that she was beginning to understand why suicide had always appeared to be a compelling option for her. She believed that if she committed suicide, others would remember her for a very, very long time. This is an excellent example of suicide as a magical act, which I described in Chapter 2. There is in her view of suicide no idea of death. On the contrary, she classed suicide as a way to defeat death. As one may do provided one believes that one can continue to live if one exists in the consciousness of another. By searching for love, the neurotic individual flees from the dimly recognized sense of isolation, and Holland was at the center of being. By being chosen and valued, one feels affirmed in one's being. The pure sense of being, of I am, of being the source of things, is too frightening in its isolation. Therefore, one denies self-creation and chooses to believe that one exists insofar as one is the object of others' consciousness. This solution is doomed to fail on several counts. The relationship generally fails because the other in time wearies of affirming the existence of the individual. Furthermore, the other senses that he or she is being not loved but needed. The other never feels wholly known and wholly embraced because the individual relates only to a part. The part that serves the function of affirming his or her existence. The solution fails because it is only stopgap. If one cannot affirm oneself, then one continually needs affirmation by the other. One is distracted permanently from facing one's fundamental isolation. The solution fails also because one misidentifies the problem. One considers it to be that one is unloved, whereas in actuality, it is that one is unable to love. As we have seen, loving is more difficult than being loved and requires greater awareness and acceptance of one's existential situation. The individual who needs the affirmation of others to feel alive must avoid being alone. True solitude comes too close to the anxiety of existential isolation, and the neurotic individual avoids it at all costs. Isolated space is peopled with others. Isolated time is extinguished, killed, with bisnisms. Solitary confinement has always been a particularly grim punishment. Others combat isolation by escaping from the present, solitary moment. They comfort themselves with blissful memories of the past, even though at the time their experiences may have been far from blissful, or they project themselves into the future by enjoying the imagined spoils of as yet unrealized projects. The recent swell of interest in meditation stems in part from its novelty and from a sense of mastery. It is rare indeed for the individual in the Western world simply to be with himself or herself and to experience, rather than dispatch time. We have been taught to do several things at once. Smoking, chewing, listening, driving, watching television, reading. We value time-saving machines, and we apply these machine values to ourselves. What can we do, however, with the time that we save except to find other ways to kill it? When one's primary motive in engaging others is to ward off loneliness, then one has transformed the other into equipment. Not infrequently, two individuals will each serve each other's primary function, and like socket and prong, fit snugly together. Their relationship may be so mutually functional that it remains stable, yet such an arrangement cannot help but be growth stunting, since each partner is known, and knows the other, in only a partial manner. These relationships resemble a frame dwellings where the component walls support each other. Remove one partner, or strengthen one in psychotherapy, and the other falls. Ordinarily, however, there is no such mutual fulfillment of needs. At some level, one realizes one is being used rather than engaged and searches elsewhere for a more fulfilling partner. A 35-year-old patient of mine, obsessed with the fear of loneliness, was plagued by the vision of eating alone at 63. She was consumed by the search for a permanent bond. Though she was an attractive, vivacious woman, one man after the other met her and after a short encounter broke off the relationship. They were driven away, I believe, both by the intensity and desperation of her love need, and by an awareness that she had little love to give. An important clue to an understanding of her dynamics was to be found in her other interpersonal relationships. Highly judgmental, she rapidly and contemptuously dismissed all those who were not potential mates. When treating a patient who has difficulty establishing an enduring relationship, it is always rewarding for the therapist to inquire deeply about the texture of the patient's other, less intense relationships. Love problems are not situation-specific. Love is not a specific encounter but an attitude. The problem of not being loved is more often than not a problem of not loving. A particularly clear example of relating to others to avoid confronting isolation occurred in the treatment of Charles, the patient with cancer who was introduced into an outpatient psychotherapy group, see Chapter 5. Charles began therapy because he wanted to improve his relationships with people. He had always been withdrawn and aloof and had settled comfortably into this distant mode of relating to others. The advent of his cancer and the prognosis of a 2-year life expectancy resulted in his feeling of great isolation and catalyzed his efforts to get closer to others. The illustrative incident I shall describe began when one member, Dave, informed the group that because of his job and service training requirements, he would have to leave town and the group for several months. Dave was highly upset by this move, as were all the other members. Aside from Charles, the group members shared with Dave their feelings of sorrow, anger, and disappointment. I quote from the group summary. The summaries were mailed to the members after each meeting. The floor gradually shifted to Charles by my pointing out that he was responding to Dave only in a problem-solving fashion, and I wondered what his feelings were. This opened up a truly remarkable episode in the group. Quite some period of time Charles denied having any feelings whatsoever about Dave's leaving the group. We tried to milk feelings out of him without success and wondered whether or not he would want people to miss him if he were leaving. That too didn't get anywhere. I pointed out to him that once he had stated he had a pain in his chest when people left the group, and he underplayed that by saying that was only once. I kept pressing and said that once was enough, but he smiled and laughed and pushed us all away. After a while then Charles told the group, almost as though it were in passing, that he had learned from his medical checkup that his cancer was doing much better than could possibly have been expected. We then learned that, in fact, his medical checkup had been on that very day. Dave asked him, "Why didn't you tell us before?" Charles's excuse was that he wanted to wait until Lena came. Lena arrived a few minutes late. I told him that I didn't see why he couldn't have told us and then told Lena again when she came. Then Charles said a really remarkable thing. Now that he thinks his cancer is getting better, he suddenly finds he doesn't want to meet people any longer, and he finds himself withdrawing. Fusion. The human being's universal conflict is that one strives to be an individual, and yet being an individual requires that one endure frightening isolation. The most common mode of dealing with this conflict is through denial. One elaborates a delusion of fusion and proclaims in effect, "I am not alone, I am part of others." And so one softens one's ego boundaries and becomes part of another individual or of a group that transcends the individual. Individuals whose major orientation is toward fusion are generally label dependent. They live, as R.E. puts it, for the dominant other, and are likely to suffer extraordinary distress in the event of separation from the dominant other. They submerge their own needs, they seek to find out what the others wish, and make those wishes their own. Above all, they wish to avoid offense. They choose safety and merger over individuation. Kaiser's description of such individuals is particularly clear. Their behavior seems to suggest, "Do not take me seriously. I do not belong to the category of adults, and cannot be counted as such." They are playful, but not like someone who likes to play, but like someone who does not want, or does not dare, to appear serious and matter-of-fact. Distressing, and even tragic, events are mentioned laughingly, or in a hurried, nonchalant way, as if it were not worthwhile to waste time on them. There is also a readiness to talk of their own shortcomings with an inclination to exaggerate. Achievements and successes are put in a ridiculous light, or the report of them is followed by a compensatory enumeration of failures. Their talk frequently might appear chopped up by quick transitional shifts in topic. By taking unusual liberties like blurting out naive questions, or using baby talk, they indicate that they want to be put into the category non-adult, and should not be counted among the grown-up people. Kaiser describes the clinical behavior of a patient particularly bent on merger with a more powerful figure. For 8 months G had been seeing a man in his late 30s who appeared ready to do whatever he understood was being requested of him. Whenever G had wanted to switch the appointment to another day or another, the patient's answer had invariably been, "Certainly, doctor, certainly." He was always on time, but never seemed to mind if G were delayed. When, during the hour, the sun came out and shone into the patient's eyes, he never would have dared to draw the drapes and lower the blinds. He sat in silence, painfully blinking and twisting his neck until G remarked on it. The patient then would respond as if G had asked him to let the blinds down. "Certainly, doctor, certainly," he would say, jumping up from his chair and unhooking the cord. "This way. Doctor? Is this too much?" Fusion as an answer to existential isolation provides a construct by which many clinical syndromes may be understood. Consider, for example, transvestist. Ordinarily, men with transvestist are understood to be motivated by castration anxiety. There is such threat in being a man, in competing for women with other men, that the man opts out of competition by dressing as a woman. At which point, his castration anxiety, assuaged by self-inflicted castration, is able to achieve genital sexual release. However, Rob, whom I discussed in Chapter 4, illustrates how fusion may be a central organizing dynamic. Rob had cross-dressed since he was 13, first using the clothes of his sister, and then those of his mother. Too frightened of males to develop relationships with them and too fearful of rejection to approach females, Rob had always been extraordinarily isolated. His fantasies while cross-dressing were always non-squasal, and always variations on a fusion theme. He simply imagined going up to a group of women who would welcome him into their company and consider him one of them. His interpersonal style in a therapy group reflected his desire for merger. Docile, obsequious, pleading for attention from the members but especially from the therapists whom he exalted. During the course of the therapy group, Rob received an eye-opening education on the possibilities of relationship. He became fully aware, I believe for the first time, of the extent of his isolation. I'm neither here nor there, neither man nor woman, isolated from everybody, he said one session. For a while his anxiety and the incidence of cross-dressing increased markedly. Gradually, as he developed social skills and related in meaningful ways at first to the group members and then to individuals in his life environment, all transvestite desires left him. There is, of course, a heavy overlap between the concept of escaping existential isolation through fusion and the concept of escaping the terror of death through belief and immersion of oneself in an ultimate rescuer. Not only Rob, but many of the clinical examples of the defense of the ultimate rescuer in Chapter 4 are descriptive too of fusion. Both concepts describe a mode of escaping anxiety by escaping individuation. In both, one looks for solace outside the self. What differentiates the two is the impetus, isolation anxiety or death anxiety, and the ultimate goal, the search for ego boundary dissolution and merger, or the search for a powerful intercessor. The distinction is, of course, academic. Generally, motivations and defensive strategies coexist in the same individual. Fusion eliminates isolation in a radical fashion by eliminating self-awareness. Blissful moments of merger are unreflected. The sense of self is lost. The individual cannot even say, I have lost my sense of self, because there is in fusion no separate I to say that. The wonderful thing about romantic love is that the questioning lonely I disappears into the we. Love, as Kent Baugh comments, is the answer when there is no question. To lose self-consciousness is often comforting. Kierkegaard said, with every increase in the degree of consciousness, and in proportion to that increase, the intensity of despair increases. The more consciousness, the more intense the despair. One may also shed one's isolating sense of self by fusing, not with another individual, but with a thing. A group, a cause, a country, a project. There is something enormously compelling in merging with a larger group. Kaiser first became aware of this during an ice skating show when two performers, dressed identically, skated a complicated number in perfect unison. After the applause, they nonchalantly and inferiorly adjusted their ties and simultaneously looked at their watches. Their post-applause synchronization excited the audience even more, and Kaiser along with them, and he reflected upon the joys of ego boundary softening. Uniformity of movement and synchronization of movement, if both come close enough to perfection, attract, thrill and fascinate an audience no matter whether or not the movements performed by a single individual would in themselves be pleasing. A single well-trained soldier going through the steps and paces, the turns and halts of his drill may please the eyes of the training officer, and the outsider he looks ridiculous. If a whole battalion moves over the parade ground, all in step, breaking up the large column into smaller groups, all making the turn at exactly the same moment, turning again and forming one long straight line and maintaining this unbroken front, marching and pivoting around, and then, on one short signal, freezes on the spot so that all the arms and legs, the helmets, canteens and rifles are suddenly at rest, all in exactly the same position with not even a single bayonet deviating in direction from all the others, then even an ardent antimedalist cannot help being gripped by this spectacle. And what grips him is certainly not the beauty of right angles and straight lines, but the image, or rather the idea of the many acting as though animated by one mind. To be like everyone else. To conform in dress, speech, customs, to have no thoughts or feelings that are different. Saves one from the isolation of selfhood. Of course the I is lost, but so is the fear of alliances. The enemies of conformity are, of course, freedom and self-awareness. The conforming fusion solution to isolation is undermined by the questions: what do I want? What do I feel? What is my goal in life? What do I have in me to express and fulfill? In the age-old struggle between self-expression and safety in fusion, it is usually the self that is compromised for the sake of isolation avoidance. The lore of the group is powerful indeed. The Jonestown tragedy demonstrates. To take one of countless examples, the power of the group. Identification with the group offered the members a haven from the fear of isolated existence. A product so valuable that they were willing to sacrifice everything for it. Their worldly goods, their family, friends, country, and eventually their lives. Mysticism, which involves heightened, marvelous moments of oneness with the universe, is also an instance of ego loss. Fusion with another individual, with group or cause, with nature or with the universe, always involves a loss of self. It is a pact with Satan, an event you ties in existential guilt. That guilt grief which laments the unlived life in each of us. Sadism. The fusion-seeking individual who is dependent, obsequious, self-sacrificing, who will bear pain, who in fact enjoys pain because it dispels solitude, who, in short, is anything the other wishes in return for the safety of merger, has a curious counterpart. One who seeks to dominate the other, to humiliate the other, to inflict pain, to make oneself the absolute master over the other, seems very different from the dependent fusion seeker. Yet, as Fromm points out, both tendencies are the outcomes of one basic need, springing from the inability to bear the isolation and weakness of one's own self. The sadistic person needs his object just as much as the masochistic needs his. The difference between the masochist and the sadist is between fuser and fusee. One seeks security by being swallowed by another, the other by swallowing someone else. In both cases, existential isolation is assuaged, either through losing one's separateness and isolation, or through enlarging oneself by the incorporation of others. That is why masochism and sadism often oscillate within an individual. They are different solutions to the same problem. Sex and isolation. Freud introduced the concept of the symbol in psychic organization. In Chapter 5 of the Interpretation of Dreams, he describes various symbols that represent a sexual theme, either the sexual organs or some sexual act. The idea of one thing standing in for another could be carried too far, Freud warns. A cigar is not always a symbol for a penis. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. But Freud does not go far enough in his warning. It is possible that sex may be a symbol of something else. If the deepest ultimate concerns of the human being are existential in nature and relate to death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness, then it is entirely possible that these fears may be displaced and symbolized by such derivative concerns as sexuality. Sex may be used in the service of repression of death anxiety. On several occasions I have worked with patients with metastatic cancer who seemed obsessed with sexual concerns. I have met with married couples, one of whom had terminal cancer, who spoke of little else except their sexual malagenstant. At times, in the heat of the discussion during the recriminations and countercharges, I forgot entirely that one of these individuals was facing imminent death. Such is the success of the defensive maneuver. In Chapter 5 I described a young woman with advanced cervical cancer who found that her disease not only did not discourage male suitors but, on the contrary, seemed to increase their numbers and their sexual appetites. Ellen Greenspan described research demonstrating that women with severe breast cancer, in comparison with an age-matched healthy cohort, had a higher incidence of illicit sexual fantasies. There is something gloriously magic about the lure of sex. It is a powerful bulwark against the awareness and the anxiety of freedom, since we, when under the spell of sex, have no sense whatsoever that we constitute our world. On the contrary, we are captured by a powerful external force. We are driven, enchanted, we fall for. We can resist the lure, delay it, or give in to it. But we have no sense of choosing or creating our sexuality. It feels outside of us. It has a force of its own and seems bigger than life. Sexually compulsive individuals in therapy report, as they get better, a sense of bleakness about their lives. The world is mundanized, and they ask, is this all there is? Compulsive sexuality is also a common response to a sense of isolation. Promiscuous sexual coupling offers a powerful, but temporary respite to the lonely individual. It is temporary, because it is not relatedness but only a caricature of relationship. Compulsive sex breaks all the rules of true caring. The individual uses the other as equipment. He or she uses and relates to only a part of the other. To relate in this mode means that one forms a relationship, and the quicker the better to have sex, rather than the converse situation of sex both as a manifestation and a facilitation of a deeper relationship. The sexually compulsive individual is the example, par excellence, of one who does not relate to the whole being of the other. On the contrary, he relates only to that part which serves to meet his need. Our language well reflects this attitude, as when we speak of a piece of ass, a jock, a stud. The stark language of sex, laying, making, fucking, screwing, turning a trick, scoring, denotes deceit, aggression, manipulation, almost anything in fact but caring and relatedness. Above all, sexually compulsive individuals do not know their partners. In fact, it is often to their advantage not to know the other, and to keep most of themselves hidden. Therefore they show and see only those parts that facilitate seduction and the sexual act. One of the hallmarks of sexual deviation is that one individual relates not to another whole person but to some part of another. A fetishist, for example, has a relationship not with a woman. All published cases of fetishists are males, but with some part or some accoutrement of a woman. For example, a shoe, a handkerchief, a piece of underclothing. One observer of human relationships went so far as to say, if we make love to a woman without relating to her spirit, we are fetishists, even if in the physical act we use the proper body orifice. Should, therefore, the thoughtful therapist deplore any sexual encounter that falls short of a true and caring interpersonal encounter? Is there, then, no place for sex as an act of uncommitted adult play? These questions are to a large extent ethical and moral, and the therapist does well to avoid making pronouncements on issues that lie outside of his or her field of expertise. But the therapist does have something of value to say in the case of those who relate sexually to others only in a partial function-oriented manner. An essential part of the definition of sexual deviancy is that behavior is fixed and exclusive. That is, the deviant can relate sexually only in a prescribed deviant manner. Not only is rigid, exclusive sexual behavior indicative of deeper pathology, but such behavior cannot help but result in a sense of self-contempt and existential guilt. Kierkegaard drew an arresting sketch of such a situation in the Diary of a Seducer, wherein the protagonist devotes his entire self to the seduction and abuse of a young girl. Though he is successful in his aims, he pays a heavy price for his spoils. His life becomes empty, his spirit impoverished. Thus, the sexually compulsive individual neither knows or engages the other. He never concerns himself with the other's growth. Not only does he never have the other fully in sight, but he never loses sight of himself in the relationship. He does not exist between but always observes himself. Buber terms such an orientation reflection and bemoaned a sexual relation where the partners do not engage in a full authentic dialogue, but live in a world of monologue, a world of mirrors and mirroring. Buber's description of erotic man is particularly picturesque. Many years I have wandered through the land of men, and have not yet reached an end of studying the varieties of the erotic man. There a lover stamps around and is in love only with his passion. There one is wearing his differentiated feelings like metal ribbons. There one is enjoying the adventures of his own fascinating effect. There one is gazing enraptured at the spectacle of his own supposed surrender. There one is collecting excitement. There one is displaying his power. There one is preening himself with borrowed vitality. There one is delighting to exist simultaneously as himself, and as an idol very unlike himself. There one is warming himself at the blaze of what has fallen to his lot. There one is experimenting. And so on and on. All the manifold monologists with their mirrors, in the apartment of the most intimate dialogue. Thus, one is in love with passion, one collects excitement and trophies, one warms oneself at the blaze at what has fallen to his lot. But what one does not do is to relate authentically to oneself or to another. Many of these themes are illustrated in the dreams of Bruce, a sexually compulsive patient I described in chapters 5 and 6. Toward the end of therapy, as he was emerging from a sexually driven mode of relating, Bruce began to turn his attention to the problems. If I do not attempt to screw women, what do I do with them? And what do I do with men? What are people for anyway? That last question, what are people for anyway, emerges in one form or another in the treatment of all patients who begin to change their modes of relating from I to I thou. 3 dreams heralded this stage in Bruce's therapy. The first. I was lying in bed with my 14-year-old son. We were fully dressed, but I was trying to have sex with him, but I could not find his vagina. I woke up sad and frustrated. This dream graphically depicts Bruce's dilemma about relationships. Is there any other way than genitally, the dream seems to say, that you can relate to someone, even to someone you care for very much? The second. I was playing tennis with a woman, but every ball I hit came back to me rather than to her. It was as though there were an invisible glass backboard instead of a net separating the two of us. The imagery is clear. Bruce was presumably engaging someone else in tennis, but in fact was relating only to himself. The other person was extraneous in the game, and furthermore, even though he tried to reach her, he could not. The third. I wanted to be close to Paul, an acquaintance, but I kept bragging about how much money I had, and he got angry. Then I tried to put my cheek next to his, but our beards were so rough that we hurt one another. Bruce had companions in activity. Basketball, tennis, and bowling chums, but had never had a close male friend. He was dimly aware of his yearning for closeness, but, as the dream illustrates, could find no way to relate to men except in a competitive fashion. Other forms of miscarried relationship. We try to escape the pain of existential isolation in a variety of ways. We soften ego boundaries and attempt to fuse with another. We attempt to incorporate another. We take something from the other that makes us feel larger, more powerful, or cherished. The common interpersonal theme in these attempts, and in a number of others, which I shall now discuss, is that the individual is not with the other person. Instead, the individual uses the other person as equipment to serve a function, and a mutually enriching relationship never occurs. Instead, there is some form of misalliance, a relational miscarriage which can only stifle growth and evoke existential guilt. As the sheer variety of unauthentic modes of relationship defies any exhaustive classificatory scheme, I shall describe a few common modes observed in clinical work. The other is elevator. Larry was a 35-year-old engineer with the engineer syndrome. He was stiff, cold, and isolated. He displayed no emotion whatsoever and was generally aware of emotion only after he took note of a physiological cue, knot in stomach, tears, clenched fist, and so forth. His major goal in therapy was to get in touch with his feelings, and to be able to establish a relationship with another. A physically attractive man, he had little problem attracting the attention of women but was not able to develop a relationship further. Either he found a woman undesirable and dismissed her, or he found her desirable but was too anxious to pursue her. Finally, after many hard months of therapy, Barry began dating, and then living with Jamelia, a young woman whom he found very attractive. It immediately became apparent, however, that he invested little of himself in the relationship. He discussed in therapy his new problem of going to bed very early. Did it mean, he wondered, and this type of isolation from his feelings was highly characteristic, that he was already bored with Jamelia? Or did it mean that he felt so comfortable with her that he allowed himself to relax with her? How can you find out? I asked. What happens when you ask yourself whether you love Jamelia? Barry responded, with unusual conviction for him, that he cared for Jamelia very much. Still, he decided it was best to hold himself back so as not to arouse her hopes unduly. He explained that the relationship would never evolve into a long-term one because Jamelia did not quite match up to what he had been looking for in a woman. The main reason was that her social skills were not highly enough developed. She was not sufficiently articulate, she was too inhibited and socially introverted. He knew that he did not speak well and wanted very much to marry a woman with greater verbal dexterity. Since he learned well by imitating, he had hoped to improve as a result of contact with such a woman. He also expected a woman to provide him with a less restricted social life. Furthermore, he worried that if the two of them spent too much time alone, and became very loving, then he would give all his caring to her and would never have any to give to others. Barry's statements illustrate many of the most common problems that preclude the development of an authentic, loving relationship. The most basic one is that the raison d'etre of Barry's mode of relating was to serve a function. Barry began from a position of extreme need, and searched for someone to minister to this need. His need was for elevation, and he searched for a partner who would be elevator. Teacher, therapist, and purveyor of social life. Barry often talked despairingly of his long, fruitless search for a relationship. I felt that his use of the word search provided a key to understanding his problem. One, after all, does not find a relationship. One forms a relationship. Barry approached Jamelia in an inorganic rather than organic fashion. Not only did he view her as an object, as equipment to provide a particular product, but he viewed the relationship as static and inorganic. An entity that was there almost fully formed from the beginning, rather than as a developing process. Another patient voiced the same theme when he said that the closer he got to another person, the more unattractive that person became, both physically and emotionally. As he physically approached a woman, he could see her faint skin blemishes, her varicosities, and the bags under her eyes. As he got to know her well, he became increasingly bored by her diminishing stock of anecdotes and facts. In such an inorganic approach to relationship, one views the other as an object with certain fixed properties and depletable resources. What one does not consider is that, as Buber reminds us, in a genuine organic relationship there is reciprocity. There is no unchanging eye observing and measuring the other. The I in the encounter is altered, and the other, the thou, is altered as well. Barry viewed love as an exhaustible commodity. The more he offered to one person, the less he would have for others. But, as Fromm has taught us, this marketing approach to love makes no sense. Engaging others always leaves one richer, not poorer. Barry had always experienced intense anxiety at the prospect of approaching women whom he felt matched his standards. Often he ruminated for hours on the proper approach. He would start to call a woman hand on the phone, number half dialed. He would flush with anxiety and hang up the receiver. Other therapists had unsuccessfully attempted to afford Barry anxiety relief through behavioral approaches. In psychotherapy, no progress occurred when we approached the problem from the obvious vantage point. That is, that Barry feared competition from other men and rejection from obviously attractive women. There was, however, considerable progress when we explored the ways that Barry used, or wished to use, the other. At a deep level, Barry knew that he was not encountering but violating the other. He did not want her but wanted something from her. His anxiety was guilt because of the anticipated transgression against another and fear that the other would discover his motives. How many people are in the room? In a mature, caring relationship, one relates with one's whole being to the other. If one holds back part of oneself in order to observe the relationship or the impact one has upon the other, then, to that extent, one has failed to relate. Buber describes the situation that develops when two individuals who retain full self-consciousness try to relate. Let us now imagine two men whose life is dominated by appearance, sitting and talking together. Call them Peter and Paul. Let us list the different configurations which are involved. First, there is Peter as he wishes to appear to Paul, and Paul as he wishes to appear to Peter. Then there's Peter as he really appears to Paul. That is, Paul's image of Peter, which in general does not in the least coincide with what Peter wishes Paul to see, and similarly, there is the reverse situation. Further, there is Peter as he appears to himself, and Paul as he appears to himself. Lastly, there are the bodily Peter and the bodily Paul. Two living beings in 6 ghostly appearances, which mingle in many ways in the conversation between the two. Where is there room for any genuine interhuman life? One may fail to relate by relating only partly to the other and partly to some fantasized other person as. In assessing the nature of my relationship with the patient, I find it helpful to inquire of myself, how many people are in the room? Am I, for example, thinking not only of the patient but also of how clever I will sound when I present this patient at a conference, or of the interesting clinical material which I can use to communicate more effectively with my readers? I pose the same questions to my patient. Is the patient really relating to me, or to some ghostly figures from the past? As the patient describes to me his important relationships, I wonder how many people are in each relationship. Are there only 2 people involved? Or 3? Or a whole auditorium filled with people? Camus was a master of portraying, in his novels, characters who could not love but who feigned love for some ulterior purpose. In his first novel, A Happy Death, unpublished during his lifetime, Camus's protagonist says, he saw that what had attached him to Marthe was vanity, not love. What he had loved in Marthe were those evenings when they would walk into the movie theater and men's eyes turned towards her. That moment when he offered her to the world. What he had loved in her was his power and his ambition to live. That moment when he offered her to the world. That captures it precisely. There were never 2 people in the relationship. He related not to Marthe but to others through Marthe. Similarly, Ken, a patient of mine who had deep-seated problems in relating authentically to women, dreamed profusely but never had a dream with only 2 people in it. An illustrative tag-along dream in the middle of our work. I was with a woman in my old bedroom in San Francisco at 2:30 in the morning. My brother and father were watching through the window. I wasn't too interested in the woman or the lovemaking. I kept my father and brother waiting for an hour, and let them in at 3:30. Important associations to the dream included his attempts to identify the woman. He realized that he was quite interested in her. She resembled a young cheerleader he had seen that day at a football game. The kind of girl he never had the nerve to approach when he was in college. She also resembled a girl, Christine, he had dated in high school. He and a friend had both dated the same girl for several months. A situation that he found both uncomfortable and exhilarating. Finally, he and his friend joined forces and pressured Christine into choosing one of them as her steady boyfriend. Christine chose Ken, much to his delight. However, within only a few weeks the bloom had faded. Ken lost interest in Christine. He was never interested in her in the first place. He was interested only in her function in his competition with his friend, and ended their relationship. Ken had always viewed his father and brother as competitors. First for his mother and then for other women. In the dream, his being with a woman and keeping his father and brother waiting outside enviously for an hour, until 3:30, which incidentally was the time of our regular therapy hour, was a way of besting them through a woman. Ken could not be with men either. He related to me, to his brother and father, to all male friends, in a highly competitive fashion. When he was with me, for example, he was so convinced that I wanted to subjugate him that for months he withheld any important material he felt would give me an edge over him. His only male friends were talented but did not evoke competition since their talent lay in some entirely different field, music, art, or athletics. On the night following the analysis of this dream, Ken had a series of short dreams, all illuminating some aspect of the work to be done in relationships. In the first dream, he went to a ski lodge and met several of his male friends who greeted him warmly. Then he found himself sitting next to them in a room where he was waiting to take his final real estate examinations. Ken was a realtor. After a long wait, the exams were passed out, but immediately the instructor, his therapist, announced the exam was cancelled. They had come to the wrong place on the wrong day. This dream underscored Ken's fusion of friendship and competition. The work ahead in therapy would entail dissenting the two. The second dream fragment was that Ken saw himself on a jumbo jetliner. He often, as do many dreamers, symbolized therapy as a journey on some vehicle. He strolled along in the aisle on the plane and was astounded to discover several hidden compartments, all of which were full of people. Although he saw them for the first time, he somehow knew that these people had been there all along. Obviously, this dream represented another crucial task in therapy: the discovery of the others in the world. His last dream that night was but a fragment, simply an image of a large toucan bird. Ken had no associations whatsoever to this bird, but my association to toucan was to Ken, a representation of the work in pairing that lay before Ken. This bad faith mode of relating to others is so common that examples abound in everyday life and everyday therapy. For example, the woman who purposefully takes a new boyfriend to a gathering where she knows her old boyfriend will be as obviously not with her new friend. Carl, another patient, was with a new girlfriend when he received an angry, demanding phone call from his previous one. In a derisive manner, he held the phone away from his ear, pointing it to his new friend so that she too could hear. Each of an individual's relationships reflects the others. It is rare, I believe, for one to be able to relate in bad faith to some individuals and in an authentic, caring way to a select few. Carl's new friend was deeply troubled at his treatment of a previous friend. She suspected, and rightly so, that the telephone episode was an ominous portent of her future relationship with him. Being with the other for the sake of another is particularly transparent in group therapy, a mode of therapy ideally suited to uncover and work through bad faith in interpersonal relationships. A graphic example unfolded over several weeks in one of my therapy groups. Ron, a 40-year-old married patient, systematically made extra group contacts with every one of the members, even though he and the rest of the members realized that such socializing often impeded therapy. Ron invited some members to go sailing, others to go skiing, and others to dinner, and became intensely romantically involved with one Irene. Extra-group socializing is usually destructive in group therapy only when it is surrounded by a conspiracy of silence. In this group, therapy ground to a halt because Ron refused to discuss his extra-group contacts, especially those with Irene. He saw nothing wrong with them, and steadfastly refused to examine the meaning of his behavior. In one session, the group discussed his inviting my female co-therapist for a skiing weekend. Enormous pressure was placed on him to examine his behavior, and he left the session confused and shaken. On his way home, Ron suddenly remembered that in his childhood his favorite story had been Robin Hood. Following an impulse, he drove to the children's section of the nearest public library and reread the story. Only then did the meaning of his behavior make sense. What he loved about the Robin Hood legend was the rescuing of individuals, especially women, from tyrants. That motif had played a powerful role in his life, beginning with edible struggles in his family. He had started a successful business by first working for someone else and then setting up a competitive firm and enticing his ex-boss's employees to work for him. So too with his wife, whom he had married not so much because of love for her but to rescue her from a tyrannical father. Similarly, the pattern unfolded in the group. He was strongly motivated to wrench the other members, even the co-therapist, from my grasp. The other members gradually expressed their deep dismay at having been mere pawns in Ron's struggle with me. When his predominant inauthentic mode of relationship was laid bare and fully understood, Ron began to confront the question of what else are people for. He spent several months working on his relationship with each of the members, save Irene. He clung tightly to her, and even when it was clear that he had made all the progress possible for him in that group, he resisted termination because, at an unconscious level, he wanted to be present so as to protect her from me. He eventually terminated, and a few months later Irene did as well. At that point, without the tyrant in the picture, Ron's love waned quickly, and he ended the relationship. A full caring relationship is a relationship to another, not to any extraneous figure from the past or the present. Transference, paratakesis, distortions, ulterior motives and goals, all must be swept away before an authentic relation with another can prevail.